Hi, my name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I am a lesbian and a feminist, and I have talked about Drake Bell already kind of quite a bit on this channel in my previous videos, but those were all coming at it from the angle of being a lesbian and a feminist and criticizing a feminist or purportedly feminist activist organization for not handling things in the way that I would have liked them to, or in a way that I thought was internally consistent with previously stated morals. To borrow phrasing from Christy Carlson Romano, actually, in an interview that she did that included her response to the Quiet on Set documentary, I think of those videos in retrospect as being sort of insider baseball. Which is to say that if you enjoyed the insider baseball and, feminist analysis of the feminist group in the first few videos, this is going to be retreading quite a bit of that same information, but this time around we're coming at it in more of a what is the public perception of this thing way, rather than in an everyone here considers themselves to be a feminist and we want to provide helpful critiques of a movement kind of way. I don't know if that makes sense. You can find those other videos in the playlist linked in the description, but they are certainly not required viewing for this one. This is kind of implied in all of my videos about Quiet on Set, but I do just verbally want to denote we will be talking about descriptions of child abuse and domestic violence in this video. I also want to note that because I do not like to subscribe to the algorithm's idea of making us talk around things. From what I have heard, though I'm still very new and very, very grateful for the traction that I've gotten so far, from what I've heard, the algorithm doesn't really like it when people don't subscribe to those talk around the things rules. So I would love it if you would maybe subscribe to me, but that's up to you. I also, kind of clearly, I'm reading from a script, and less clear, but I used to be a barista and then a call center person. My mouth just moves like this. So if you're typing out some pseudoscience body language analysis thing, or you think I'm being disrespectful because you can see too many of my teeth, I think you can tell the difference between when I'm smiling and when I'm just moving my mouth. So you're also welcome not to watch if you don't like it. I just want to be clear about that because I have conversational videos, intentionally so, but I do want to be clear that I in no way intend to make light of any of the subjects that I'm talking about today or to belittle the trauma that anybody faced. So let's get into it. In the 2024 docuseries Quiet on Set, Drake Bell came forward with a story about horrific abuse that he had suffered at the hands of a man named Brian Peck. This documentary was the first time that Drake Bell was publicly associated with this story, though the story itself, but with the name of the victim and a lot of the identifying information associated with him redacted, had been public knowledge already just due to the way that court systems work. Brian Peck eventually ended up serving 16 months in prison due to Drake cooperating with local law enforcement to get a confession out of Brian Peck. This story is told in more detail in the Quiet on Set documentary, and also by a reporter that I just want to give a shout out to, who I really, really appreciate the work of, Kat Tenbarge. Kat featured on the Matt Bernstein A Bit Fruity podcast, which I love and highly recommend. They talked about Drake Bell and the cycle of abuse. I also will link in the description to some articles by Kat, not just about Drake Bell, but, so you can get a look at some of the kind of advocacy work that she does. I just really, really appreciate the reporting that she does. Kat is extremely knowledgeable and empathetic, and I think she does a really good job of laying out in more detail, but without you needing to kind of go through some of the things you would go through by watching the documentary if you watch that podcast episode. Anyway, though, and as is retold in that podcast episode, Drake Bell worked with local law enforcement to get a confession out of Brian Peck in regards to what he had been doing to him, and Brian Peck would eventually serve a jail sentence of only 16 months and get a conviction of being a sex offender tied to his record. Something we are going to be talking about a lot in today's video, and that has become a big subject of conversation around Drake Bell, Brian Peck, and Quiet on Set, is actually, I think, a factor in how short that prison sentence was. Several letters were written in support of Brian Peck by former colleagues, other actors in the space, former and present. I think it's unlikely that those letters didn't have any impact on the length of the sentencing that Brian Peck received. Though I do have concerns about the ways that we speak about some of the people who wrote letters. We're going to get to it. I also want to note that because I think most coverage about this doesn't quite stop to qualify, Brian Peck was employed on The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, a show that two of his support letter writers were involved in the production of in some capacity, but claim that they weren't involved with hiring him for. Either way, he ended up having a voice acting role. He voiced a mirror. This was something that was added in post and likely, hopefully, means that he was not around the child actors. It just feels possibly like valuable context when we say, oh, he was on The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. He should not have gotten hired again on children's television. I absolutely believe that. But I also just want to make it clear he was not hired onto Sweet Life of Zack and Cody in a dialogue coach capacity, as he had previously worked for Nickelodeon. Something Drake Bell has mentioned on multiple podcast appearances, and, a conspiracy theory that has leaked into my own comment section based on his statements. Drake Bell feels as if he has been set up by Nickelodeon. This narrative, I think, may even be something that he genuinely feels and not just something he is trying to convince people, but it feels as if the betrayal that he felt by the existence of these public letters, which got unsealed for the Quiet on Set documentary. And from what I have read, the unsealing of the public letters by the documentary crew is what informed Drake's decision to sit down for the documentary at all. Once they asked him for a statement about the letters, and, assuming, even with positive intent here, assuming that he realized that they were going to be telling his story with or without him, he decided to sit down for the documentary at that point. But I want to talk about this conspiracy and these letters today. But before we do, I want to kind of give you something to just keep in mind, which is the principle of Occam's razor. If you're not familiar, Occam's razor is basically just, if you're looking at a set of options and trying to determine what's most likely, you go with the one that requires the least amount of explanation. Doctors apparently use the example of if you're hearing hooves, look for horses, not zebras, because, there's a lot less leaps that have to be made in logic in order for a horse to be a lot of places where you would require a lot of explanation to explain why a zebra was there, unless it was a, I can't remember the name of that movie. I guess unless it was like a Madagascar situation. That's the one where they escaped from the zoo, right? I'm sure there wasn't another movie with animals that I'm mistaking for that. It had to be Madagascar. Anyway, unless you have like a zoo escaping issue, but that's still more leaps in logic than a horse that's normally like outside on your neighbor's pasture, because this sounds like an old-timey phrase, and like less old-timey than when we refer to a thought principle as a razor, but it's still, you know what I mean. Anyway, I am presenting you with a conspiracy, the one that Drake Bell is putting forward, but I'm also asking you to remember that the most likely explanation is often the simplest one, and Drake's version of reality is one that might make sense initially if you find conspiracy theories easy to swallow, but that falls apart if you consider the most obvious answer, which is that maybe it's not a conspiracy, maybe it's just consequences. So just obligatory, I have not been paid by Nickelodeon. Nobody has reached out to me and offered me any money or information or incentivized me in any way to talk about this. I'm doing this because I am a feminist and because I stand with Drake Bell's victims. the anonymous one who received some semblance of justice in court, and the women who have come forward with claims about domestic violence they suffered at his hands who did not go through the legal system. I believe the people who have come forward about him having inappropriate interactions with teenagers and performing at high schools, and I think with the amount of evidence that we have that those things are true and are a pattern of behavior of Drake Bell, it would genuinely be foolish of me not to stand with those victims. Like I said, I would like to talk about the letters that were written on behalf of Brian Peck, and I would like to do that with some nuance. Again, I think what Brian Peck did is horrific. I do not think he should have been able to work on another children's show, though I will point out it doesn't look like he continued to be employed by Nickelodeon specifically after his conviction, right? And there are lots of letters that were written in support of Brian Peck that I have no intention to defend in these videos. I think the adults should have known well enough to examine the information that they were being given and just not written a letter in support of somebody, even though they were certainly being given an incomplete picture of the extent of what their colleague had done. I say that because to hear the boys from the Boy Meets World podcast tell it, they were presented with a version of the truth that looked like contrition from the friend asking them to write these letters. They, and likely other people who wrote letters based on statements that have been given in response after they were unsealed, were told that it had been this situation where Brian Peck had been tricked into going too far with a boy who was younger than he had initially believed him to be. A lot of them are written along lines of like, oh, maybe Brian assumed Drake was older than he was, or that Drake acted older than he was, as if that made what Brian did to him okay, which it does not. All of these claiming that Brian Peck had been pressured, or saying that surely it couldn't be as bad as what had been said to the court. This is disgusting. It's not how anything works. Brian Peck is an adult. You are likely to suffer some consequences if you write a letter for a friend of yours who has poor behavior without really examining whether or not that poor behavior is out of character or just surprising to you. Because surprising to you and impossible for the person to do are completely two different things. I think a missing piece of nuance, though, in discussion around this is that idea of the incomplete picture people were writing their letters based on. Again, I am not defending the letter writers, but some of the people who wrote those letters, yeah, they knew Drake. They mentioned him by name as they were making these horrible allegations about him that framed him as the problem in his own assault. But a lot of them didn't. A lot of them seem to just have been character references for their friend who they had never personally seen act that way. Not every letter, I think, has been made publicly available, and I know that not everyone who wrote a letter has responded to requests for comment from the press, but many of the people who did stated something to that effect, that they had been presented an incomplete picture of what happened, and so they defended their friend, and importantly, that they regret having done so and would not do so if they had the information they now have about the situation. I think this is important to remember, especially considering the large capacity I find in the general public for forgiveness and compassion towards Drake Bell himself and things that he would later go on to do, things that directly harmed people in a much more direct way than writing a letter in support of an abuser does. The conversation loses a lot of focus, and people complain that pulling focus to what Drake Bell did is wasting time where you could be speaking about Brian Peck's own claims, which are very extensively documented, unlike a lot of the rug-swept things about Drake Bell that get brought up. I think the real true derailing here, the actual waste of time though, is this desire to enact revenge on people whose poor behavior in the past is writing a letter based on incomplete information. Again, I will state, I think this is a poor behavior. I think they should feel sorry for this. I think putting a statement out to that effect is a good thing, and I'm disappointed, actually, that James Marsden team hasn't put together some kind of, response to this. But my point is, I believe that the Brian Peck defense that happened, and it did happen, but it happened decades ago and is over with now. It was effective, again, to the point of likely shortening the length of time that he would serve in prison for his offenses, but it wasn't effective to the point of saving his public reputation. Those letters didn't keep him from being known as a notorious predator or as a sex offender. In fact, Brian Peck was widely known to be a predator long before Quiet on Set. Even Shane Dawson talked about Brian Peck a long time ago, like in 2017, I think. And that was after, the 2014 documentary An Open Secret, which in part talks about Brian Peck. What happened to Drake Bell is horrible. In the Quiet on Set documentary, he outlines his experience being assaulted and violated by Brian Peck, being groomed, and having Brian end up interfering in his relationships with his parents as part of his increasing constant access to Drake during that grooming. And also, I do think that it is horrible that after he worked up the courage that it took to report all of this to adults who could do anything about it, to seek justice through the court, and then find out that all of these celebrities and future colleagues even showed up to support Brian Peck. I also want to note, though, that we don't have a record of how full that courtroom was or exactly who was there beyond Drake's recollection that it was packed and full of supporters of Brian Peck. I bring that up only to mention that it does not mean and has not been confirmed that everybody who we know wrote letters appeared at the court trial. At least some of them did, which makes sense. But we just don't know to what extent people who wrote those letters even may have known until the unsealing in the documentary that Drake was the anonymous minor. A lot of them did, especially if they went to the court and saw him there after not knowing when they wrote the letter. But I have to assume not everybody went to court. According to IMDb, after that 16-month stint in jail, as I mentioned, there are a handful of roles that Brian Peck has picked up, including that one on Sweet Life, appearing in things very sporadically before those seemingly completely cease in 2015. Drake Bell, on the other hand, would continue a working relationship with Nickelodeon for many years after that trial. At the time of him coming forward to the police, he said in the documentary that Drake and Josh had been just about to start. So Drake continued to work for the network, being in Drake and Josh until 2007, and then returning for movies on the channel, both in and outside of the Drake and Josh universe. I mention this not to invalidate Drake Bell's trauma or to imply that I think that if he would have stopped acting, that would have meant his trauma was more valid at all. I entirely understand why he would continue to act when everything else was falling apart. I do mention it, though, to invalidate the theory that Nickelodeon has an interest in punishing him for having their buddy Brian Peck outed as a predator. In a world where Drake had been completely blacklisted from Nick after Brian Peck faced legal consequences, I might believe that they were vindictive towards him in response to some extent. But think about how convoluted the claim gets when you think about how long Drake had a seemingly fine working relationship with Nickelodeon as a studio, a relationship he doesn't mind plugging when it promotes, as he did in Quiet on Set, that Dan Schneider was a perfectly good boss to him, apparently, that he was the only one to reach out to Drake before the trial. Drake's theory here relies on them being willing to employ him and promote him to being the face of even other famous Nickelodeon franchises, not just Drake and Josh, but starring in the live-action Fairly Odd Parents reboot, but also secretly hiring women to come forward with stories of abuse about him, just in case he ever said something about what had been done to him as a child and already dealt with through the legal system. Do you really believe that? Do you think that Nickelodeon found a 15-year-old girl and asked her to start a relationship with Drake Bell? Why do you think that they would know that he would take that bait if I thought that that was something that Nickelodeon was doing, which I don't? Or is the conspiracy that every single woman who has had a relationship with him already organically had the relationship with him, which includes the teenager that he pled guilty to recklessly endangering through their, sexual text conversations, as well as former romantic partners. And every single one of them immediately flipped and agreed to make false allegations for money? I think it's a huge disservice to turn the harm that Nickelodeon faces into something being done by a shadowy, secret, shady organization. that is out to punish and silence former actors and not to acknowledge it for what it was. Harm that was perpetuated by a faceless conglomerate that allowed true evil to happen, not because it was funding and encouraging the evil itself, but because the evil was flourishing in the conditions by which they were finding profit for their shows. It was so focused on profit that it didn't care to protect its laborers. They weren't paid per inappropriate sexualized joke that Dan Schneider snuck into his shows. They created an environment where a Dan Schneider could happen. And then he happened. And they didn't notice it because they were really happy that he was making them a lot of money. I think this fascination on Nickelodeon as being inherently evil and out to cause as much harm as it possibly could rather than reckless is a disservice because it derails the conversation away from anything that can possibly be worked into actionable change for those child actors of today who are still on set in those environments. Unless the end goal of this is just for Nickelodeon and Disney to stop existing, but then smaller corporations with less and less oversight will be the people employing children. And I don't think that's good either if we're not focusing on protecting the child actors themselves. And I think the reason that Quiet on Set really didn't want to take the time to look at how Drake Bell perpetuated some of the harms that he faced really is not because they were making a moral decision to focus the conversation, but because, they wanted to keep their star happy. So they spend less than 2 minutes to perform a little rug sweep that was effective enough for him to take off running with it after the documentary. And take off running with it he did. Following the release of the Quiet on Set documentary, Drake Bell released a music video called I Kind of Relate, which dramatizes the story that he told in the documentary and other moments in his life. And at the end of it, on his YouTube channel, he embedded in it a conspiracy theorist's video that attempts to debunk the claims that Drake pled guilty to and cast it as if the victim came forward in order to draw attention away from Brian Peck and everybody who enabled Brian Peck to get away with causing harm. I implore you, if you are concerned about child actors, to be concerned about it in the way that you are concerned about the exploitation of all workers and not in the way where you believe that the Nick logo was made to intentionally look like Epstein's Island. Sexual assault and sexual harassment happen at all kinds of workplaces where the workers are not protected, and especially when it comes to children, that protection of workers is crucial. And real actionable change could be made to protect these child actors if we could focus our attention onto things like providing them equitable protection from a union that other adult actors can receive, as Christy Carlson Romano mentions in that interview I mentioned earlier, or enacting legislation that insists on more reasonable working hours, higher standards for education. We can't accomplish any of that if we are 2 seconds away from accusing Dan Schneider of just drinking the blood of his child actors for their adrenochrome. We need to stay grounded here if we want to do any good for anybody. There's just no reasonable basis for the belief that Nickelodeon has anything to do with the women who have come forward with stories about Drake Bell. There is a reasonable basis for belief, though, in the stories that have been brought forward about Drake Bell. One of his former partners, a woman who alleges that Drake Bell held her in a bathtub and attempted to scald her with hot water, and she said in statements that she made on TikTok that from Drake Bell, she suffered the most horrific abuse imaginable. It is not lost on me that those are words that Drake Bell used to refer to his treatment by his own abuser. And I'm not discrediting him feeling that about what he went through. But I am saying that I got immediate douche chills when I heard it because I remembered hearing that from Melissa almost word for word. I find it hard to believe that you could forget somebody saying something like that about you. And while I find it hard to believe that Nickelodeon, the faceless conglomerate, has an interest in attempting to sway search results, I think it's not as insane as I was afraid it was in my earlier videos to allege that There might have been some motivation in reconditioning what people will think of, or maybe what they see, if they search those words and Drake Bell's name. Drake Bell also had a private Discord server with his fans, even after having purportedly learned his lesson with the anonymous victim who he pled guilty to the reckless endangerment of. In that Discord server, he was sending links to videos for them to comment on like it's their day job, asking them to correct what he perceived to be misinformation, asking them, even when they were already defending him, not to use the word victim in relation to the woman that he pled guilty to the reckless endangerment of and distribution of harmful materials to while she was a minor. I have seen defenses of that Discord server and his actions in there. I see people buying into the rhetoric that therapy is an impossible thing for former child actors to attain, and saying that he was actually not being inappropriate in the Discord because he was crying out for help. And my response to that really is, you didn't learn not to cry out for help to your fans the first time you got in trouble for texting a teenager? Because anyone of any age can sign up for Discord, and I highly doubt they were stringent about age verification there. But even if they were, it would have been really easy to bypass and impossible to verify who actually was in that server. I mean, that's something that's obvious by the fact that screens have leaked and we know what was going on in there, right? Though I will say, just for the sake of being thorough here, we know what was going on in the Discord server that was private but open to fans. We don't know what was going on in any secret channels, splinter Discords, DMs, group chats. Even if we accept that Drake Bell pled guilty and only believes that some of the allegations that he accepted responsibility for were actually his to take responsibility for, those things were having a similarly kind of inappropriate relationship with a vulnerable fan. Even if it were not sexual, though I believe both the victim and also Drake Bell's lawyer, who said that the conversations were in fact sexual in nature. And just like people lied about Drake Bell and claimed that he was coming on to Brian Peck, fans of Drake Bell allege that the teenage victim in the court case lied to Drake about her age, that he stopped talking to her when he learned. This is not true. In court, the lawyer attempts to use the fact that he said hurry up upon hearing that the minor he was texting was 15 as evidence that it proves that he didn't intend to do anything with a minor. And I might understand that if instead of saying hurry up, he had ceased his inappropriate relationship with the minor, but he did not. He didn't block her. He just said, well, then hurry up, and then seems to have continued having an inappropriate relationship with her. Inappropriate and recklessly endangering, you could even say. The court did. If you are horrified by people writing letters in support of Drake Bell's abuser, of them accusing his victim of lying, of them protecting him and his career and his reputation based on their own perceptions and understanding of him, understand, please, that every tweet, every comment you make, every TikTok you share and thoughtless comment you say about the women who have come forward about Drake Bell's abuse is the same thing. You are discrediting those survivors. You are picking the career of an established, famous man who has swarms of fans he can emotionally manipulate into doing his dirty work over the survivors of real harm that he perpetrated. You can be horrified by what Brian Peck did and by what Drake Bell grew up to do and how he continues to act about those actions even after having claimed to have accepted responsibility. In fact, I think you should be. I think genuinely anything else is kind of a morally inconsistent take, and I implore you not to let the guilt that you feel for having enjoyed Drake and Josh and your wish that it had been a better experience for that actor not to cloud something that should be pretty simple. For anybody who has been involved in this man and for their sake, I hope that you are safe and happy and that you are not having to see too much of this discourse. I hope it's not enough that you even have to stumble across my video, but if you find other videos about Drake Bell, I hope you do find this one, because I want you to know that people believe you, people see you and what you said and what you came forward about. I want you to know that I am really, really sorry that this is the way that you're being spoken about, and that I'm doing what I can to create change in the conversations around you in my corner of the internet, and that other people are too, and that they also believe you.
We saw 4 different women making this allegation, Melissa Lingfield making allegations, as well as the person who actually got a case taken all the way to court. So we're talking 6 potential victims. At what point do we start listening to the victims and not discrediting them?
DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim and Offender. It's something that Johnny Depp used on Amber Heard to great success. It's something that Michael Jackson used to accuse his survivors of being money-hungry liars. And it is what Drake Bell is attempting to do to his multiple accusers following the release of this documentary.
And Drake talks about how significant of an impact it had on him to have people in the entertainment industry defend his abuser. Imagine how much of an impact all of this is having on the victim in the 2021 case. Because it's not just Hollywood who is on her abuser's side. It's the entire internet.
Yeah.
And every time that Drake re-ups this, he's putting her through that again and again and again and again.
And she is never getting her documentary.
No.
Because she is not famous.
Exactly.
So basically what I want to focus on is that Drake Bell is not a great person. So, because he's on this quiet on set and he's speaking about things that have happened to him, you can listen to that and hear him, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't make him a good person, or it doesn't take away from the fact that he's also done things to other people. Okay.
After Drake came forward with his story about being abused by dialogue coach Brian Peck while on the set of The Amanda Show, Alexa has seemed to turn something I call Nickelodeon trauma bait into her bread and butter, all while ignoring the voices of Drake Bell's alleged victims. Alexa Nikolas unlisted her Drake Bell exposed video. She's been plugging Nickelodeon t-shirts and liking every one of Drake Bell's recent Instagram posts. She's been reaching out to people who continue to expose Drake's inappropriate relationships with minors, like this person on TikTok, telling them specifically to take it down. Fans of Alexa and EP were rightfully hurt and confused to see her go back on something so important.
Did she say reported survivors?
And it was basically about how the Drake Bell reported survivors were being harassed, which there are predators out there that need to be eaten. Wasting it on...
Yeah, Drake Bell! Wait, you were so close, babe. You were so close. But I think she'd make a big change with educating her audience about Drake Bell. I mean, she's a sign behind it that says protect survivors, not predators. Drake Bell can be both of those, but that doesn't mean that he shouldn't be talked about.
To anybody else watching, especially if you are feeling especially confronted by the idea of being just as bad as the people who wrote the Brian Peck letters, remember the compassion that I extended to those people who were not seeing the full picture at the beginning. If you haven't been seeing the full picture until now and your eyes are starting to open, that's still good and positive, and I'm happy to have you here. This is not my final planned video about Quiet on Set. I would like to examine the documentary itself. You can find a recent community post of mine to see 2 of the different ways I'd like to do that, and it's looking like I'm going to go ahead and make both of those videos, so please subscribe if you would like to make sure that you see those when they drop. And if you're looking for more of me, you can find me on Patreon, or you can make a one-time donation on Ko-fi if you're interested in supporting me financially. Thank you so much to everybody who already has, either by supporting the Patreon, sending me a Ko-fi, or by watching the videos all the way through to the end. I always remind people of this in my last few videos. My comments are a moderated space. Comments repeating misinformation that I have debunked in this video will just be deleted. Comments being dismissive or cruel to the victims will be deleted. Freedom of speech protects you from the government, not the Justin, you know? Don't let Drake Bell tell you how to talk about all the shit he did wrong. Bye!